Thank you everyone for coming. We are here for the World Building Fantasy Writing Workshop with Mary Celestin. Check out the 7th grade exhibit. She is the curator of that. You can leave a comment in the end. You all did a really good job. And I will turn it over to Mary.
Awesome. Is there a way for me to share my screen yet? Oh, great. Awesome. So let me share. Okay, cool. Everyone can see my screen. Awesome. So, hi everybody. Thank you for participating in this workshop. I had a lot of fun curating this art exhibit for your class. Someone wants to and yeah, so I had a lot of fun doing that. A little bit about me. My name's Mary Celestin. I'm a senior engineering major at Harvey Mudd College, part of the Claremont colleges in Claremont, California. I'm really passionate about smart cities, innovative ways of reinventing our cities from a structural engineering perspective, a manufacturing perspective, lots of diverse perspectives there that I'm interested in. I even like things like sewage. I'm really passionate about it. And also from a community building perspective on how we can make our cities more like cohesive communities. That's how I met your teacher through my work as the founder of San Jose Strong, which is a grassroots organization to reinvent San Jose for and by the community that through a lot of serendipitous events I founded this summer, and has been awesome to be a part of something so powerful for the community with such awesome people who just make really, really cool projects that I'm just in awe of. So that's a little bit about me. But in my free time, when I'm not doing engineering school or working as an engineer or doing San Jose Strong, I'm a musician, so I'm really passionate about music, and I'm also a fantasy author. So I've written and published a number of poems, short stories, spoken words. I self-published my first novel when I think I was your age. I was in 7th grade when I finished my first novel, and I've been working on my trilogy since then for the past 8 years. So I'm on book 2. We're chugging along, but I love everything world building. Obviously, like even if it's about cities or about creating fantastical worlds that people can engage in. So I'm here to present a quick 101 educational seminar on speculative fiction. And then I have some fun activities for everyone to engage in to build their fantasy world building skills. I first presented this workshop at the Claremont colleges through the creative writing club there. And I'm excited to present it to you guys here today. So this is Speculative Fiction 101. Let's see if it's going to let me change the slide. Okay, cool. So first, what is speculative fiction? Speculative fiction is an umbrella genre encompassing narrative fiction with supernatural or futuristic elements. This includes, but is not limited to, science fiction, fantasy, superhero fiction, science fantasy, horror, utopia, and dystopia fiction, supernatural fiction, as well as many combinations of it. And so I'm going to dive into a little bit of what some of those sub-genres look like, but this is the umbrella that we're working under. So first, we're going to talk about fantasy. Fantasy almost always has a magical or supernatural element to it. Magic is often explained by real-world folklore or mythology, and the author uses their imagination to create narrative elements that don't rely on history or nature to be coherent. And so the cool thing about building a fantasy world is that for it to be believable and for it to be something that an audience is going to buy into, you have to make sure that all of the laws that you create are consistent. So even if those laws are pretty fantastical and they bend our natural world, if they're consistent within this fantasy world, then the reader can buy into it. If anyone's an anime fan, I've been watching a lot of My Hero Academia recently, and sometimes I'm like, wow, these quirks are wild. For those who don't know, it's about a supernatural future where 80% of the human population is born with quirks, a special supernatural ability, and and it's like pretty fantastical, some of the quirks that the characters have, but like it fits within the world building and is consistent within the world building. And I think that's why it has such an on-cult following, and why I'm in season 4 and started it a couple weeks ago during break. So that's a little snippet there. And that leads us into the distinction between high fantasy and low fantasy. So high fantasy is set in an alternative, entirely fictional secondary world rather than the real or primary world. The secondary world is usually internally consistent, but its rules differ from ours, right? So that's what I was just talking about. In My Hero Academia, you're in the future, and so you do buy into our world. I think that's kind of high and low fantasy situation. But the example we have here is Lord of the Rings, right? That's like just super high fantasy. You're in Middle Earth, a completely different planet that doesn't really have ties to our world. An example of low fantasy is Harry Potter. That's set right in the middle of our world, yet you have magical events that are intruding in that space. Now this leads us to science fiction. So science fiction has imaginative concepts that are reliant on advanced science or technology. So you'll have scenes set in the future or in an alternative history, space exploration. So all things Star Trek would fall into science fiction. Biological explanations for supernatural happenings. So if you have a superhero who gets their powers through some form of scientific experimentation, and that ties into science fiction, which I love science fiction as an engineer and a STEM major. So I love being able to explore and see, like if I actually calculated like what could that look like, and be able to bend some of the rules of where we currently are and predict into the future a bit. It includes undiscovered scientific possibilities, right? So you could talk about things like time travel, teleportation, things that are not real now, but you could fathom a world in which they are real, rather than someone saying, I'm just going to snap my fingers and I can magically transport. It's like, no, I built a device that relied on this technology and this higher level math in order to do it. That's the distinction between science fiction and fantasy. You can have new and different political and social systems and situations too. It's not just reliant on, technology that's being used in this really cool, somewhat fantastical way. It can be something that's very, very haunting. I think a good example would be 1984, right? So you have an omnipresent surveillance system that watches everybody, right? That's advanced tech for when it was written in the 1940s, but that's something that has relevance today. And you look at how our technology impedes and how we can always be watched, right? So there's ways you can have social and political conversations while plugging into sci-fi to predict the not so distant future. And so, so here are some examples. I forgot that I wrote 1984. But so 1984, Big Brother is watching you. Ex Machina is a cool example of artificial intelligence. You have Captain America, all things Marvel, and Star Trek Space Odyssey. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about horror. Sometimes I think we can integrate horror in non-horror genres. There's plenty of elements in famous fantasy or sci-fi shows that have horror elements, but then you also have shows that in movies that are specifically meant to focus on horror. I think a personal favorite of mine is Insidious. I think the Insidious trilogy is a really well done exploration of horror. But yeah, the goal of horror is to frighten, scare, disgust, or to startle its readers or watchers by inducing feelings of terror. And there's a distinction between speculative horror and realistic horror. So speculative horror is where the antagonist or the world is based in sci-fi or fantasy. Well, realistic horror is based in the real world, right? So you can have horror that doesn't tap into speculative fiction. It could just be a serial killer in our modern day that doesn't do anything fantastical with it. Or you can have horror that has really trippy elements. I think the Jordan Peele films are really great examples of that, which are examples, right? So you have sci-fi horror, Get Out, Us are pretty good examples of sci-fi horror. Frankenstein, right? Someone is like, what if I could create this humanoid thing, right? That's science fiction. Alien life forms come here, they take over and accept us 28 days later. And then you have fantasy horror. So Coraline is an example of fantasy horror. I love Coraline. I love Neil Gaiman's work in general. And in Coraline, the protagonist in her house finds a door that brings her to an alternate world where she has her other mother and her other family. And there's buttons. It's a whole thing if you haven't read it, but it's fantastical. When you talk about things like vampires, a lot of those kind of mythological things, that goes into fantasy horror. And so, there's realistic horror that doesn't tap into what we're talking about today, but within horror, you have sci-fi and fantasy horror. And then here are some more examples of things that fall under speculative fiction. And then what makes speculative fiction important? So speculative fiction is almost always used as a way to view the real world problems through a new lens. Audiences can read and watch and be entertained, which not only makes the lessons of the stories extra accessible to them, but also to a certain extent tricks them into reflecting on the circumstances in their own world. That's what draws me to writing speculative fiction. I wrote the first piece that I officially wrote and technically published was in the first grade. I had recently moved and was trying to get acclimated to the new environment and where I was. And I kept talking to my mom about these 3 mermaids that would fight this mutant squid. And she was like, hey, I think you should sit down for 30 minutes a day and write this story. And so I ended up writing this short, it was like a 28-page picture book story, short paragraph story that I published in my elementary school library titled Legend of the Mutant Squid. And looking back, it was all about the protagonist. She was all about being kind and how that would help her make new friends. And in the end of the day, save the world, save the sea. So that was just me figuring out how to be a new kid in a new school. And this is this world that I came up with to process that. And so for me, I found that speculative fiction really allows you to reflect without having to confront all the time and be immediate about it. And it's a good mediator for introspection and self-discovery. And so, yeah, that's the presentation. Now for the remaining portion of our time, it says I'm sharing the screen. Okay, let's see if I can click out. Sometimes, okay, I don't want to stop sharing, but it's also not letting me click it because there's all of the buttons. So let's see, I'm going to stop sharing for a quick second so I can log out. I don't know if you guys know that, whenever you have a presentation, but the button to exit is right where all the share button stuff is, so it doesn't let you share all the stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to share again. Yeah, and so this is the quick document of activities for us to go over. And since I think you guys have until 4-ish, we have two main activities to work on and a brief introduction. So I have some questions I want you guys to think about before we get started in this activity. And before we do you can be thinking about it while we have some quick introductions. And so these questions to think about is going to help you essentially start to build your own world. The goal is at the end of our workshop today, you'll have the beginning of a story, beginning of an arc and a world for you to explore. So questions that you should consider before world building in any story is your world in our timeline or in another world, right? So is it Lord of the Rings in some other fantastical place, or is it, for example, something like Hunger Games, which is set in our world, well into the future, but still set on our planet? Then you want to think, if your world is in our timeline, what year is it in? So is it in the future? So like the trilogy I'm writing is 600 years in the future. I can also explain a bit about my trilogy too if we have time at the end. But yeah, so what year is it in? Is it in an alternative past? There's some really good books and series and shows that are like, what if something else was different? Or what if we're in, an alternative version of the past? Or is it in the present? And if it's in the present, it can be an alternative present, or it could just be our present, and that will influence your ability to play with low or high fantasy. And then you have to consider, what are the laws of nature? So what are the physics of your world and what makes sense? So if you live in a world where a bunch of people have superpowers, you have to build a society and a culture and a history that makes having superpowers being normal, make sense. And so it's like, how does what makes sense make sense? So if you're like, okay, I can use an example for my trilogy. It's set 600 years in the future. There's a lot of things that happen, but one aspect is that all mythological, fantastical creatures that we thought were just fantastical are actually very real and evolutionarily plausible and possible and present. And the thought there is that 10,000 years ago, when a lot of 10,000, 2,000, 3,000, however many years ago you want to consider, where there's sort of history and documenting of these myths. That's when our population was at such a small scale that it made sense for a lot of these other smaller species, more powerful one-to-one, but compared to like us being 7 billion people with nukes and being super parasitic and dominating and destroying lots of nature and taking over things, where we are today, it doesn't make sense for a lot of those creatures to populate our space because otherwise we'll make them extinct. Whereas fast forward 500 years from now, a bunch of things happen. The human population is much smaller than it is right now. And a lot of those creatures come back to dominate more of the physical space and interact with the humans. The humans are now at the bottom, or lower, close to the bottom of the food chain, right? And so you can exist in a world where you have lots of fantastical creatures, but it makes sense how we got there within the context of this world that I'm building. And people can buy into that. And so then that ties into, the next thing to consider: how does your society or multiple societies and the politics function? What's allowed, what's not, and what is the history? If we're in our timeline, how did we get from today to there? Like, how did it all start? And then if you're in an alternative timeline, if you go into something like Lord of the Rings, I keep bringing it up, there's so much history, even if it's not explored directly in a specific book or a specific scene. Like, the author knows the full history of this world. And so that's what you have to do as an author. Even if like there's history that maybe is mentioned once, maybe isn't even mentioned in like 5 books that you write, but it's relevant to just understanding the cohesiveness of this world you're building. That's something to consider. And then terminology. How do you define things and why? So there's, for me, a lot of the terminology will tie back to either like a cultural context or something to do on a scientific level. So there's a species called Shatiras. You've discovered that's effectively like a vampire, but Shatira is a derivation for the scientific word for bat. And that's like how that became the word used. And there's also like different like tribes, pack groups that have names that stem from different dialects or tongues outside of English. There's some undead there, which is, the name is Mari, which is Haitian Creole for undead. I'm Haitian American myself, so that inspired a lot of that. But yeah, and you also want to consider the language you use. There's so much language that we use that's niche to our location and our time. And if you're going to be outside of the present moment, if you're going to go outside of, oh, we live in the early 2000s or 2000, like 2021. If you want to go outside of that and really make it believable, if you're going into the past, you really have to learn the history of the past. But if you're going into the future, you really want to separate it so that you don't get pulled out of the world. My mom's a big fan of sci-fi, and she'll mention, actually, I think this was in Lord of the Rings. I keep bringing this up. It is in Lord of the Rings. It's like 10 minutes in, and the protagonist, Frodo, says something, and she's like, yeah, that makes no sense why he would say that. It was a modern phrase, and it broke the spell of being in this other world. That's also something you want to consider. And so, yeah, and that's our brief overview. So now you guys know a 101 on what speculative fiction is, and you have these questions to start thinking. I am going to go over what your first activity is, and then before we get started, I'm going to have everyone, if you're comfortable, do a quick round of introductions, because I think we're lower on time. We're going to have 10 minutes to work on this first scene, and then we'll have 10 minutes for people to share what they've written or what they've come up with. This first activity is writing a scene around a theme, right? So you want to start with these 2 sentences that I have written here. It says, she knew there wasn't much time. The thing began to race towards her. You can take that wherever you want. Sometimes you just have to write a short scene around a central theme, and then you can build from that scene to where it goes and how it got there and work backwards. And so sometimes that's how I work with writing. I'll just have a feeling, there'll be something I'm thinking about, something on my mind, and I just want to write a quick synopsis, a quick short story about it. And then you're like, wait, how did this character get here? And then you can build a world around that, right? And also sometimes I imagine storylines or scenes going alongside music. You know, I'm a musician. I'm really passionate about music. So if this helps as well, consider picking a song to accompany your scene. That can help you imagine your world as a movie and make it more realistic in your mind. And having that soundtrack can be integral in that. You know, if there's a fight scene, what does that look like? You know, if this is a love scene, what does that look like? If this is a friendship scene, what does that look like, right? What would the vibes and the sound be about it? And so before we get started, for introductions, to go around and say your name, your favorite subject right now that you're learning in school, and why. And then one fantastical thing. If one fantastical thing could be real in your life, what would it be? So I'll stop sharing for a brief second so we could go around and do that. If folks are comfortable with popcorn, We can do popcorn. And so I'll popcorn to Kimberly first. If you're comfortable, you can talk. If not, you can type in the chat and say, I don't want to talk.
What do I have to say again?
Your name, I guess your name is already here, so it's new. So you don't have to, you can repeat your name if you want. Your favorite subject you're learning in school, and then if one fantastical thing could be real in your life, what would it be?
My name is Kimberly, and my favorite subject is math. And I'm not sure, something like one fantastical thing that could be real. I'm not sure. What would it be?
Okay, you can think about it while you're creating this brief story. If you wanted to popcorn it to someone else in the room.
I'll popcorn it to Fatima.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my name is Fatima, and my favorite subject is well, I don't really have one. I like all of them the same. And one fantastical thing that I wish could be real, or like, yeah, I wish my cat was nicer.
That's a good wish. Cats can be tricky sometimes. Thank you for sharing. Who do you want to popcorn it to?
Hmm. I hope I don't pronounce your name wrong. Yvonne?
My name's Yvonne, and my favorite subject is art. And I'm not sure about the fantasy thing.
I guess I can also say for myself, something fantastical that I'd love to be real. I would love to be able to breathe underwater. That'd be kind of cool. I could just go swimming and not have to worry about it. If it was sci-fi, I'd come up with some way for me to like have fish genetics that gave me gills on my side or something. But that's an example. Yvonne, who do you want to call on? Yvonne.
I'm probably gonna say their name wrong, but Amani.
Hello? Oh, mic doesn't work. That is all good. If you could type your answers in the chat, that'd be awesome. I can popcorn for you to Min if you'd like to. I hope I pronounced her name correctly.
Of me?
Yes, I think. Yes.
My favorite subject has to be art, and one fantastical thing that I wish could be real was stands. They're basically they're kind of like Pokemon, but if it gets hurt, you get hurt. But it's really cool. But yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing. We have one last person to share for their introduction, and then I'll let everyone work on the first activity. But I'm not too sure how to pronounce
popcorn Vaibhav.
Vaibhav?
Vaibhav.
Vaibhav? Okay. Hello. Okay. All good. No worries at all. So great. I'm going to share my screen again. You guys will have the next 10 minutes to work on this activity. I think what I'll have us do is that I think so. We have 25 minutes. So if you can start working mainly on the first activity, but if you're struggling with the first activity or you want to explore the second activity, that's totally cool too. I think we can spend the next like 15 minutes just working on the first and the second activity. So you might want to spend like 7 to 8 minutes on one and 7 to 8 minutes on the other. If you really like one, you can spend all your time on that, and then we can just share at the end. So, you know, repeating the first activity, the text right here where it says, she knew there wasn't much time, the thing began to race toward her. You can start to write a theme, and you want your scene to center around a theme. That theme could be, you know, friendship is the most important thing. Or it could be, what does respect look like to me, right? You know, what are some kind of key intangible themes that can become tangible in your writing? The second activity is all about drawing a schematic. So, you know, here's a starter that you could choose, which would be create a world 400 years in the future, 500 years in the future, where there's only 500,000 humans still alive. Lay out the society, you know, the rules, the world, the universe. Think critically about the words you use and why. There's also a third backup activity. If you've hated both of these options, you can define the enemy. Sometimes to help build the plot for your story, it helps to figure out who's the antagonist and why. Or even, you know, is there an antagonist? Do you want things to be good, good, bad, bad? There'll be an antagonist in some way, but your antagonist doesn't have to be just plain out evil. It can be a complex character that you learn to love and maybe even turns out to be a hero in their own right. So these are some activities to consider doing. And yeah, you can just write. I'll mute myself. And you guys can jam out. Can I mute myself? I don't know how to. It's my first time using this platform. Oh yeah. If you have any questions, you can feel free to let us know. And you can message in the chat or talk. And you can message directly to me too if you're like, don't want to talk to other people. roughly 5 minutes left to keep working on your activities. Okay, start to wrap up. I'll give everyone roughly a minute to finish writing your work, and then we can do a roundtable share. Okay, awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed working on your present your workshop stuff so far. Is there anyone who would like to share what they worked on?
I can share. I did activity 2, where you imagine a world with only 50,000 humans. And I just wrote a bunch of words I would use to describe it. It would be really awesome, and 50,000 sounds like it would be bad and depressing, but it would be futuristic. It would be like future Mayan world where the farming, the living is pretty good, and lots of nature. I haven't thought of the problem yet.
That sounds really cool. Thank you for sharing.
Minon, you should share yours.
I forgot, but someone said something about robots, so I kind of got inspired by that. So I thought maybe we would live in Mars with robots.
That's really cool. Did you work on did you start with the first sentence, the two sentences, or did you start with something completely different?
Completely different.
Do you have a main character yet, or just building the scene?
Building the scene.
Very cool. Very cool. Would anyone else like to share? Thank you for sharing.
Fatima, you should share.
So, wait, can you hear me? Okay, so I did a thing where I also did when there were only like 50,000 people or 500,000 people. I forgot. And it was like they all went to this little event so they could all meet each other because, they do that. They all decided that as a society. And mine is a happy story. And two of the humans meet up and they fall in love. And it makes me really happy. Now I'm crying. Oh my god, stop.
That sounds like a really cool story. And it's fun to have, romance is something that is timeless, that happens past, present, or future. But it's always cool when you get to place it in the future. So thank you for sharing that. I'm excited to see what happens to those characters. We have a few more minutes left if there's anyone else.
Kimberly, what'd you write?
I got an idea of the robots, like you said, and I just at first I didn't know what to write, but then I like just got an idea, and it was that like a bunch of robots started to take over, and there was just like two human beings there, and she didn't know what to do, and I wasn't able to finish.
That sounds like a great start. Yeah, the expectation was not for anybody to finish, but just to start thinking about it. That sounds like an interesting plot, like conflict. You know, you've already got a protagonist and an antagonist, it seems. So I'd love to see what happens. You know, maybe we're misunderstanding the robots, and we can live with them. Maybe I don't know. Thank you for sharing.
Ryson, what'd you write?
What were those sentences about? That's cool. Sometimes it's good to start to center your world on a protagonist and who that character is. So that's really cool. Thank you for sharing. I hope that G has a good adventure. But yeah, thank you all for sharing your work so far and participating in this workshop. Hopefully, you leave today with a better sense of what speculative fiction is and how to start building your own world within fantasy and science fiction. And thank you for having me. I had a blast curating your artwork and getting to talk to you today.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you, Mary, for this presentation.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.